Your retirement money is your boss. Your retirement savings own your job. Your pension fund holds shares in the company that employs you, the bank that lends to you, the landlord that rents to you, and the government that taxes you. Workers spent decades fighting for retirement security and got something more complex. They became the primary source of capital that finances their own economic subordination. This wasn't an accident. It was an elegant solution to a fundamental problem of capitalism: how to maintain private ownership while absorbing worker savings. The answer was to make workers the owners while ensuring they never control what they own. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. When people imagine retirement savings, they picture individual accounts, personal wealth accumulation, and freedom from work. The language reinforces this illusion: your pension, your 401k, your retirement security. But that language conceals a more complex reality. Individual workers don't own retirement assets. Pension funds own them collectively, and pension funds operate according to financial rather than worker logic. What feels like personal ownership is actually institutional ownership managed by professionals whose primary obligation is to financial returns, not retirement security. This matters because pension funds have become the largest owners of capital in developed economies. In the United States, pension assets exceed $30 trillion. That represents more wealth than the GDP of most countries. It's more capital than sovereign wealth funds, more than private equity, more than hedge funds. Pension money owns roughly 30% of all publicly traded stocks and a significant portion of real estate, bonds, and alternative investments. Workers collectively own more of the economy than any other group, but they control none of it. To understand how this happened, you need to understand what pensions were designed to solve. For most of human history, people worked until they died or became too old to work, at which point they depended on family, charity, or destitution. The idea of retirement as a distinct phase of life supported by accumulated savings is historically recent and was never intended to be universal. Early pension systems were employer obligations, not investment vehicles. Companies promised to pay retired workers a specific amount based on salary and years of service. The risk belonged to the employer, who had to manage the funds and guarantee the payments regardless of investment performance. Workers contributed through payroll deductions, but the ultimate responsibility for retirement income remained institutional rather than individual. This model worked when companies were stable, workers stayed with single employers for entire careers, and life expectancy after retirement was limited. But it became problematic as economic volatility increased, job mobility grew, and people lived longer after stopping work. Employers found themselves carrying enormous long-term obligations that could destroy profitability if investments performed poorly or if demographic assumptions proved wrong. The shift away from employer-guaranteed pensions wasn't primarily about worker empowerment. It was about risk transfer. Instead of companies bearing the cost of retirement security, that cost was transferred to workers through individual accounts and market participation. But the transition wasn't sold as risk transfer. It was sold as ownership opportunity. Workers would become investors, building wealth through capital markets rather than depending on employer promises. This transformation required a fundamental redefinition of retirement security. Instead of a guaranteed income based on work history, retirement became a financial planning problem based on investment returns. Instead of collective risk, pooling through employer plans, workers assumed individual market risk through personal accounts. Instead of retirement income as a social obligation, it became a personal responsibility requiring financial expertise most workers never developed. The practical effect was to convert worker savings into capital that could be deployed according to financial rather than social logic. Pension funds became massive pools of money-seeking returns, which meant they became powerful actors in capital markets. Fund managers were hired to maximize returns within specified risk parameters, and those managers operated according to fiduciary duty laws that prioritized financial performance over other considerations. This created a feedback loop that few people anticipated. As pension funds grew, they became influential shareholders in the companies where their beneficiaries worked. Fund managers voting pension fund shares began influencing corporate decisions about layoffs, wage policies, benefit cuts, and operational changes. Workers' retirement savings became the financing mechanism for policies that often harmed workers' immediate economic interests. The mathematics of this influence are staggering. CalPERS, the California Public Employees Retirement System, manages over $500 billion and holds significant stakes in major corporations across every industry. When CalPERS votes its shares, it can influence CEO compensation, corporate restructuring decisions, and strategic direction at companies employing millions of people. The pension fund of California teachers, firefighters, and government workers became one of the most powerful voices in American corporate governance. But that voice speaks with financial rather than labor priorities. When Walmart announced store closures that eliminated thousands of jobs, pension funds holding Walmart stock benefited from the efficiency improvements that reduced operating costs and increased profitability per remaining location. Workers lost employment while their retirement accounts gained value from the same operational changes that cost them their livelihoods. The pension fund managers had a fiduciary duty to support corporate decisions that maximize shareholder value, even when those decisions harmed the pension beneficiaries as workers. The irony became acute during economic restructuring periods. Companies would announce layoffs to reduce costs and increase profitability, causing their stock prices to rise, which benefited pension funds holding those stocks. Workers lost jobs while their retirement accounts gained value from the efficiency improvements that cost them employment. The system was optimizing for different objectives simultaneously: short-term financial returns and long-term retirement security, even when those objectives conflicted. But the deeper transformation was cultural. The financialization of retirement changed how workers thought about their economic relationships. Instead of solidarity with other workers against capital, workers developed interests as capital owners. Instead of opposing policies that benefited shareholders, workers had reasons to support them. Instead of seeing corporations as opponents in labor negotiations, workers became stakeholders in corporate success. Consider how this played out during corporate merger waves. When technology companies acquired competitors to consolidate market power, workers could experience the same event as both threat and opportunity. Software engineers might lose jobs due to redundancy elimination, while their pension funds gained value from the monopolization that increased the acquiring company's stock price. The worker experienced immediate unemployment while accumulating long-term wealth from the same market concentration that destroyed their career prospects. This cognitive dissonance extended to housing markets, where teachers' pension funds invested in real estate that their own salaries couldn't afford to purchase. The pension fund would buy apartment buildings and commercial properties in neighborhoods where teachers lived, becoming their landlords through financial intermediation. Teachers paid rent to investment vehicles funded by their own retirement savings, creating a circular flow where their current income funded their future wealth while making their present housing less affordable. The transformation was particularly visible in energy sector employment. Oil workers' pension funds held substantial stakes in renewable energy companies that represented existential threats to fossil fuel employment. Coal miners' retirement security was increasingly tied to solar panel manufacturers and wind turbine producers, whose growth meant the eventual elimination of coal mining jobs. Workers found themselves financially invested in the industries that would replace them, creating economic incentives to support their own occupational obsolescence. This shift was particularly pronounced in public sector unions, whose pension funds often held significant stakes in companies their members were striking against. Teachers' pension funds owned shares in education companies seeking to privatize schools. Police pension funds held stakes in private prison companies. Public employees' retirement security became tied to the profitability of the private firms they were supposed to regulate or compete against. The system created cognitive dissonance that was resolved by embracing financial logic. Workers learned to think like investors when considering retirement, even when thinking like investors conflicted with thinking like workers. They supported policies that increased asset values even when those policies reduced wages. They accepted market risk as the price of ownership opportunity, even when that risk was imposed rather than chosen. Pension fund managers became some of the most powerful figures in global finance, controlling more capital than most governments. They could influence corporate governance, reshape entire industries, and redirect economic development according to their investment strategies. But their power was constrained by fiduciary duty requirements that mandated focus on financial returns rather than social outcomes. They had enormous influence, but narrow objectives. This concentration of power in the hands of professional investors managing worker savings created a new form of economic hierarchy. Pension fund managers made decisions that affected millions of workers' futures, but those workers had no meaningful input into investment strategies. Fund governance structures were designed to insulate investment decisions from beneficiary preferences, ensuring that financial expertise rather than democratic participation controlled capital allocation. The irony was complete. Workers' collective savings gave them ownership of the means of production, but in a form that subordinated worker interests to investor interests. They owned the system, but the system still operated against them. They became capitalists, but without gaining capitalist power. The ownership was real, but the control was illusory. This explains why economic inequality continued growing even as workers accumulated substantial retirement assets. Pension fund ownership was diffuse and passive, while control remained concentrated and active. Workers owned shares but couldn't direct how those shares were voted. They accumulated wealth but couldn't influence how that wealth was deployed. They became the largest investor class while remaining politically and economically subordinate. The arrangement was particularly stable because it provided workers with a financial stake in the system that exploited them. Rising asset prices increased retirement account values, creating apparent wealth even when wages stagnated. Workers felt richer because their pension statements showed growth, even when their economic security decreased. The wealth was real, but it was conditional on continued market participation and couldn't be accessed without penalty until retirement. During financial crises, the contradictions became stark. When markets collapsed, workers lost jobs and retirement savings simultaneously. They experienced the crisis as both workers and investors, suffering wage cuts while watching pension accounts decline. The diversification that was supposed to provide security instead amplified risk because workers' employment and retirement prospects were both tied to the same economic system. But crises also revealed the true priority structure. When pension funds faced losses, governments intervened to stabilize financial markets rather than guarantee retirement benefits. When companies faced pension obligations they couldn't meet, bankruptcy laws protected creditors before pensioners. When municipalities couldn't fund public pensions, they cut benefits rather than raise taxes on capital gains. The system protected capital first and honored worker savings second. Recovery from crises followed the same pattern. Central banks provided liquidity to financial markets, which restored pension account values while leaving employment conditions worse than before. Workers regained paper wealth while losing bargaining power. Asset prices recovered while wages lagged. This dynamic explains why financialization felt voluntary even when its consequences were involuntary. Workers chose to participate in retirement saving plans, but they participated within a system that offered no viable alternatives. They could opt out of market-based retirement planning, but only by accepting poverty in old age. The choice was participation or destitution, which wasn't really a choice at all. The system also created generational conflicts that divided worker solidarity. Older workers with substantial pension assets had interests in maintaining asset prices, even when high asset prices made housing unaffordable for younger workers. Retirees benefited from financial market gains that often came from corporate policies that reduced opportunities for people entering the workforce. The same pension funds that secured retirement for one generation helped finance the economic conditions that made retirement security unattainable for the next. This dynamic became particularly pronounced in real estate markets. Baby boomer pension funds invested heavily in residential and commercial properties, driving up asset prices that created wealth for their retirement accounts while making home ownership unaffordable for younger workers. The same generation that bought houses with modest down payments funded investment strategies that required their children to compete against institutional capital when trying to purchase homes. In technology hubs like San Francisco and Seattle, public employee pension funds became major landlords through real estate investment trusts, owning apartment buildings where their own teachers, firefighters, and municipal workers couldn't afford to live. The pension funds generated returns from housing scarcity that their own beneficiaries had helped create through local zoning policies designed to protect property values. Workers supported policies as homeowners that harmed them as pension beneficiaries and benefited as pension holders from policies that harmed them as workers. Corporate share buyback programs illustrated the same intergenerational transfer mechanism. Companies used profits to purchase their own shares rather than investing in equipment, research, or hiring, which boosted stock prices that benefited pension funds while reducing employment opportunities for younger workers. By the 2020s, pension funds collectively owned such large portions of the economy that their investment strategies shaped economic development more than most government policies. When pension funds prioritized environmental investing, they could redirect capital flows faster than regulatory changes. When they emphasized corporate governance reforms, they could alter business practices across entire industries. When they shifted geographic allocations, they could influence regional development patterns globally. But this power remained constrained by fiduciary duty requirements that mandated maximizing returns rather than optimizing social outcomes. Pension fund managers could pursue environmental goals only when those goals also produced competitive financial returns. They could influence corporate behavior only when that influence increased shareholder value. They could redirect capital only toward investments that met risk-return requirements established by financial rather than social criteria. The ultimate result was a system that gave workers ownership without agency, wealth without control, and stake in capitalism without escape from its logic. Workers became the primary source of capital that financed their own economic subordination, and they did so voluntarily because the alternative was worse. They accepted financial risk because guaranteed benefits had been made unavailable. They embraced market participation because collective security had been dismantled. This is the final irony of retirement financialization. Workers achieved the goal they had fought for: ownership of productive assets and independence from employer whims. But they achieved it in a form that subordinated their interests as workers to their interests as investors. They became owners of the system that exploited them, and their ownership gave the system legitimacy it could never have achieved through coercion alone. The pension fund revolution wasn't a victory for worker power. It was an elegant solution to the problem of maintaining private ownership while absorbing public savings. Workers got ownership, but ownership designed to serve capital rather than labor. They got retirement security, but security that depended on the continued profitability of the system that provided their insecurity while working. Understanding this mechanism doesn't provide easy solutions, but it explains why worker politics became so confused. When workers own capital, traditional class analysis breaks down. When retirement security depends on corporate profitability, worker and owner interests align in some ways while conflicting in others. When individual wealth accumulates through collective participation in systems that produce individual insecurity, solidarity becomes complicated. The lesson is precise. Ownership without control is not power. Workers may collectively own more capital than any other class, but they control less of it than any other major investor group. Their ownership is real, but it's ownership designed to serve someone else's interests. That's not exploitation, that's innovation. And innovation, as always, favors those who design the systems over those who participate in them. Your retirement money is your boss.